The point you made about values and people being inextricably intertwined is an interesting one, and one that I've noticed rising in salience. So I think Douglas Murray might have made the point on a recent podcast with Jordan Peterson, where he said the founding of America was based on values, but those values were ultimately from, and I think Peterson finished the sentence and said, Englishmen. They were from a settled tradition, and that liberalism that we've put an ism on the end of was just a settled way of life. That there'd been this an establishment core, there'd been dissenters and nonconformists, there'd been this need for toleration to be bred, given all of the religious strife that had been taking place over centuries. And they just started it in a new continent and decided that there was a whole bunch of stuff they didn't like about the old place, which they would try and keep out. But ultimately, they're going to try and live in accordance with what they thought were the worthwhile things that they'd learned from their ancestors. And I've noticed this rising in salience in America, particularly as they go through similar things with changing demographics. And it reminds me of a quote of Franklin Roosevelt, where he said that there's no room in this country for hyphenated Americanism. The one absolutely certain way of bringing this nation to ruin, of preventing all possibility of its continuing to be a nation at all, would be to permit it to become a tangle of squabbling nationalities. And there seems to be a truth within this, because homophily, this idea of birds of a feather flock together, is a very human thing. And actually, what's been so great about the West in general is our social and cultural norms tended towards a universalizing view, where we were much more accepting than probably anyone else in humanity. However, what we're finding out is that they can quickly unravel if you put too much pressure, too much strain on this organic system through this through all these policy. And this policy we can see at government level, we can see it in the workplace through multicultural networks, where lots of people band around ethnic, religious identities, sexual identities, and they use it to shield themselves from being part of a wider core culture. And if this is what's being bred everywhere, we're actually breeding a balkanizing of society. And I think you can just see it taking place, not just online, but on the streets. And seemingly now we're seeing it amongst people who would say they've got Anglo identity, which you'd never heard of before. Do you think that is an entirely predictable thing to have happened, given what we know about humans and what we see in our culture?
So there's a number of things to say here. The first thing I'll say, just on that last point you made, is I am an example of that phenomenon that you're talking about. I mean, in my Twitter bio, I call myself an Anglo-Zoomer, right? And that's because that's how I think of myself. And that is actually an expression of identity politics, which, the right has been railing against for years now. But the point is, the kind of liberal universalism that we're talking about is paradoxically a distinctly and particularly and almost exclusively European and Anglo phenomenon. And so this idea that you can just transplant the values of a specific people to everyone is actually is bonkers and misguided. Well-meaning, I'm sure, but ultimately misguided. And that, I think, is what the story of our present era that we're living through, that's what it's actually about. It's the European mind coming to terms with the fact that their project of transplanting their high-minded Enlightenment values all over the world has failed. And that's what we really need to come to terms with now. Because what I would say is the European mind for centuries at this point has fetishized the rational element of human nature. I think it was Aristotle that said that man is a rational animal. So the European mind has fetishized the rational part of it and forgotten the animal part of it. And what happens when you forget the animal part of the rational part is the rational part collapses, because the rational part exists on top of the animal part, because the animal part is all the things that we don't really like to talk about. Like, for example, the fact that identity, what gets called identity politics, is an inevitable and perennial element of human existence. In order for humans to feel as though, essentially to feel happy, to feel as though they belong, and to feel as though they're in their right place, to feel as though they have a meaningful role in society, they need to have a sense of identity. This idea, this liberal idea that we're all just atomized individuals, totally sort of self-actualized and self-realizing, is ultimately untrue. For a small people, that is the case. There's a small number of people, generally with very high IQs, who can be these kind of perfectly individuated people. But for the most part, for most people, as you say, humans are ultimately pack animals. You know, we need our tribe. And this is revealed every single day. I mean, humans are tribal creatures, whether it's in politics or sports or, or even down to the fact, that you prefer the people you live on your road with than people who live the next road over. And it's a distinctly English phenomenon to say that, oh, the guy who lives, 2 streets down, they're foreigners or whatever. Even if they aren't literally, even if they're just as English as we are. But this is the point, right? Is I, as a 23-year-old Anglo-Zoomer, I'm part of a generation and part of a political phenomenon that is only just beginning to emerge. Because what I have recognized is that by my condition of living in a multicultural, multi-ethnic society, as I do in Britain, what that has done is brought into sharp relief the distinct and unique qualities of Anglo identity and Anglo history and British history. And it's made me realize, and this is what older generations just are not prepared to confront, is that I actually have a preference for that. I have a preference for Britain. I have a preference for British people. I have a preference for British values. I think they are better than the values of other nations and other peoples. And I would rather be around British people than non-British people because they are my own. I feel at home. I feel I belong among British people. But again, what the political class of the last 30 or so years has done is they've taken that from me. They've taken that from my generation